Good morning and thanks everyone. I see a couple other sleepy faces possibly up late watching the game last night, so exciting that you led off with that. It's funny we're starting on the note of teams and have been talking a lot about that. Obviously the Red Sox are doing great, but it's really been fascinating and fantastic to work with the team at MNN. And to Doug's point, to pull off this event year after year without outside support, just volunteers, a little help from the board, but not that much, really shows a great team. So congratulations to Jim and the team at MNN for doing such a great job on this year after year. And the exciting thing is the word is out about this conference. It was sold out 2 weeks or so in advance of the event, which means that people realize how exciting this event is. They realize the information and skills that are exchanged, and I'm glad you can be here with us. Lastly, I want to acknowledge the board, which is a fantastic team to work with. Because the Mass Nonprofit Network represents nonprofits across the whole state, we feel an obligation to set the bar pretty high in terms of the governance of this organization. And I'm really thrilled to work with the individuals who I do on the board who represent nonprofits from all around the state, from every geographic corner of the state, as well as individuals who represent every sector and subsector of the nonprofit community. And that's what allows us to have the informed voices that we do when we come to the table to think about how this organization can best serve the sector. And I think the organization serves the sector very well. And again, my thanks to Jim and the staff for doing that. MNN functions as the voice of our sector in Massachusetts. It advocates on our behalf, and MNN is always constantly looking at how to improve the capacity and support you in improving your own capacity as nonprofit organizations, and that's really what today is about. So with that, I am pleased to introduce the conference keynote panel and moderator. The panel will be discussing equity, diversity, and inclusion in the Massachusetts nonprofit sector. This panel comes at a time when nonprofits and the various stakeholders that we work with are engaged in a very deep and important conversation on reflecting how we can best serve the constituents in our community, and particularly those who have historically been and often remain underrepresented, underserved, and often oppressed. So we're thrilled to have the panel to lead us on this conversation. These include the representation of people of color in nonprofit organizations, and how we can best support our colleagues of color in their leadership and in their emerging positions. I want to introduce our panel moderator, which is my friend Michelle Hantman, who serves on the board of MNN, but also is a fellow United Way CEO. I'm a United Way CEO in recovery. She's still actively using, but we applaud her anyway. So Michelle, thanks for that. Our panel include Carol Fulp, the president and CEO of the Partnership Incorporated, Elaine, CEO of TSNE MissionWorks, and Deborah Ray, president and CEO of the Big Sister Association of Greater Boston. Would you join me in welcoming them to the stage?
There we are. Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everybody awake. How many people stayed up and watched the game last night? Okay, so some of you just got a good night's sleep. It's a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you and with my new friends here who we got to know each other over a phone call a couple weeks ago, but we're very excited to have this conversation with you. Carol, Elaine, and Deborah are all leaders within their respective fields, but definitely in the nonprofit sector representing Massachusetts. I've been asked to share a couple of words about myself. As Jim said, I am the president and CEO of United Way of Greater New Bedford. That's the United Way that serves the city of New Bedford and the 8 surrounding towns between Dartmouth and Wareham in the South Coast region. And our United Way is kind of unique. We do some of the traditional things that United Ways do, raising money, funding worthwhile organizations. But we also run a lot of our own programs. And because of that, our United Way has always been really focused on making sure that our team and the people that we serve are represented fairly, and that we are meeting things from a culturally competent perspective, as well as having multilingual staff and all of the things that go with it, which we're going to talk a little bit about today. I'm actually the first woman and the youngest person to serve in this role, and the organization, when I got there, was over 50 years old, primarily also white males on the board. I'm proud to say that many years later, we've definitely made some strides there. We're about 50% male, 50% female, and we have done a lot of great work to get more race and ethnicity represented at the board as well. So this conversation is going to be fairly organic. They don't have to answer all my questions. They can answer all my questions. There's also going to be some time for all of you to ask some questions when we're done with our Q&A piece. So please be sure to raise your hand if you have a burning question that you'd like to ask any or all of these ladies. We would love to have that opportunity for you. At this time, I'm going to give a little bit more information about each of these lovely ladies next to me, and then they're going to elaborate a little bit more personally about their experiences. So let's start with Carol. Carol Fulp is the president and CEO of the Partnership, Inc., and she's also an author. Her book was just released yesterday. She's going to do a little Vanna White for us here. So this book, just released yesterday, is called Success Through Diversity, Why the Most Inclusive Companies Will Win. There will be copies at the registration table after this program, so be sure to get that. Okay, Carol, take it away.
So, I think the book says it all for me. Success through diversity. First and foremost, it's important for you to know that I am a child of the civil rights movement. I've had the good fortune to march on Washington with my parents. I've had the good fortune to go to schools that were never opened before to students of color. And I've had the good fortune to be one of the founding members of Obama for New England. So you can imagine the history that I have seen, that I have lived through. Because I was so engaged in the Obama campaign, when he only had 10% name recognition, when we were picking him up from the airport when he was flying coach, because I was there from the very, very beginning, I had the opportunity to be appointed as his U.S. representative to the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. And that was an amazing experience, as you can imagine. So I took a leave of absence from my position as Senior Vice President of Corporate Responsibility and Marketing at John Hancock and went to New York to serve. And that was life-changing. And when you are at the podium on the stage of the UN, and you are looking out amongst the sea of ambassadors, you quickly realize that the world is black and brown and yellow for the most part. And so when I came back to Boston, I wanted Boston to be more reflective of the UN. And so I left my corporate job at John Hancock to head up the partnership, a diversity consulting and leadership development organization for executives and professionals of color. Thus, the book, Success Through Diversity.
Thank you, Carol. Elaine Ng is the CEO of TSNE MissionWorks. She only started in her position just about 2 months ago, but she's no stranger to the nonprofit sector. She brings 25 years of experience, including serving as the ED of the Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, and under her leadership, BCNC's Youth Center was nationally recognized as a champion of change by the Obama White House.
Thank you, Michelle. So Carol, I think we have a common thread of our esteemed president. So thank you, Michelle, for that. And like Michelle said, I am the CEO of TSNE MissionWorks, and prior to that, I was the ED of Boston Chinatown Neighborhood Center, and also served a short stint at Boston Public Schools too. And unlike Carol, I am not a child of the civil rights, but I am a child that was raised during Boston's busing era. And that was a sea change in my life and really shaped my experience and my perspective, because I grew up in Boston's Chinatown in a really insular community, really insular family, and wasn't really exposed to issues around diversity, race, power, and privilege until busing happened, and then was sent to schools that were outside of the Chinatown community and exposed to a level of animosity that, as a child is really hard to understand. And that has forever kind of shaped my perspective on issues of diversity and race, and especially power and influence. And throughout my career, I've focused on ameliorating some of those challenges and really grappling with them, because it shapes your experience as a person of color. And I think it also really deeply, profoundly shapes the experience of white folks in our communities as well. So the issues of equity are the foremost, and I think one of the ways we get to that is to look at diversity and inclusion. But the real challenge for us as a community, especially a nonprofit community, is to really look at equity and what that means for us.
Deborah is the president and CEO of Big Sister Association of Greater Boston. Deb was recently featured in a Comcast Newsmaker segment where she spoke about how her organization helps girls and women develop their voice to get what they want, need, and deserve, and how men can be allies to advancing women in the workplace. Deb.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning. Like Elaine, I grew up in Boston as well. I've lived there my whole life, and I've worked in Boston. And certainly, busing shaped my view of race. But it's not that I grew up in a home that talked about it, even though my mother grew up in Boston and my father did as well. But it wasn't until busing that I got my voice and started talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I started my career working 16 years in financial services, and then after that I transitioned to open my own business to help young people in the city get jobs. From there, I went on to the nonprofit sector, first at City Year, and now, in the past 12 years, working as the head of Big Sister. So although I've always valued diversity, equity, and inclusion, now it's a moral imperative. It is my responsibility to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is central to the programs in which we create at Big Sister, as well as to the internal staff, and as well as it is for the board. 91% of the girls that we serve are girls of color.
Thank you. So that was just the warm-up. Okay, so we have one mic you guys need to share. Doesn't have to go in any particular order, okay? So let's launch into our first question. All of you have borne witness to some important evolutions within the nonprofit sector, including the emergence of conversations on equity, diversity, and inclusion. From your perspective, how have the conversations promoting cultures of diversity, equity, and inclusion in nonprofits shifted over the course of your respective careers?
Okay, I'll start. So Michelle, I do think that there's been a transition, and it's gone from diversity in numbers. So when I think back on working in the private sector, even though diversity may have been a goal, it was a numbers goal. So it was what percent of the staff are, workers of color. It was all numbers. And I think that has shifted to what Elaine even talked about, to equity and inclusion. And that means it's not only for the people that work in the organizations, It's their sense of belonging. It's are they included? And with that, you have to really think about implicit bias and how that can lead to microaggressions. And that's really a shift, and I think the millennials have really made that shift for organizations. I do think it's coming from millennials pushing it. When I think back again on the private sector, as a woman coming into an all predominantly male, predominantly white male environment, I followed in that track. I followed in that leadership style of being, decisive, of being more autocratic, being less collaborative, less about consensus. And I think millennials now are saying, I'm not going to follow that way of leading. I want it to be the way that I believe we can make change. So when you hear about white supremacy culture, what they're talking about is a traditionally white male model of leadership that has influenced not only nonprofits, but for-profits. And I think what's going to change this, and I do think the change is going to come from nonprofits, because as I said, that 91% of the girls that we serve are girls of color, and that is really my moral imperative, then that's going to infiltrate not only the organization in which I lead, but also the board. And the board is made up predominantly of corporations, right? So that as we change the organization from within, and we change and work on the board, I believe that that's going to influence corporations. So that the idea that it's not just numbers, but it's the sense of belonging, the inclusion. Who are we promoting? Who is getting that plum assignment? Who is included in the decision making? That I think that is what's really the change that has to happen. But that happens as an individual level. It is not like a numbers. It's not something you're going to measure on that. You're going to measure on how people feel within the organization. Are they getting promoted? Are they included in the decision making of an organization? And do they feel that sense of belonging that is real, that it's not just surface?
Does anyone else want to jump
And I think just to build on that, I agree. There has been a shift, and part of it is also, I think, over time, the conversations around equity and diversity weren't framed that way in the past. So I'm thinking, 25 years ago when I first started working in nonprofits, and back then it was more around like anti-racism or anti-ESL movements were the things that we were all fighting against, and primarily those fights were led by people of color. And now, I think another shift that's happened is that there's a lot of white allies who are also part of the struggle and part of making things more equitable. And that's important because it's exhausting to be a person of color who's always the person talking about equity and always forwarding the conversations around race and privilege and power. And after 20 years of doing that, you're just tired. So it's great having other voices and, to have white allies at the table helping to push the conversation and in many cases now to lead the conversation. I think that's critical. And then also just building on the decision-making pieces that, and this is, I think, also due to millennials, that there's a very growing and evolving definition of power now that isn't necessarily held by the traditional white male structure, and that it's more organic and decision making is more fluid, and there's just more voices and more folks at the table. And those are significant changes, I think, in how we look at moving forward progress and equity.
Thanks, Elaine. Carol, would you like to add to that?
I think we are at a pivotal moment in time, obviously in this country, but look at the Commonwealth. And this is an opportunity for not only nonprofits to excel, but for businesses to excel. The Federal Reserve Bank put out a study that the average wealth for white families is $250,000. The average wealth for Latino families is $6,000. And the average wealth for Black families is $8. You can't even afford to buy a Frankfurter at Fenway Park if you are an average Black person. So if you look at that, how can you sustain a business in a community like that? So while the nonprofits are serving those who are most in need, businesses have to partner with nonprofits to ensure their cities and their communities are healthy so that they can operate in this commonwealth. And so we are at a pivotal time where we have the opportunity to really partner and advance our commonwealth, because a lot of people are doing well, but a lot of people are being left behind. And when you think about the demographics, it's critical to understand that the US Census Bureau indicates that by 2042, there will be more people of color in this country than Caucasians. Today, there are more babies of color born in this country than Caucasians. There are more students of color than Caucasians, the young women you are serving. If we do not address these problems now, we are going to have a South Africa where we have a large population of individuals of color who are in poverty, who are, have poor health, who are not educated, and yet you'll have a wealthy population who is Caucasian. That is our potential, but that is not who we are as a country. And so this pivotal moment requires nonprofits and businesses to partner as this demographic shift is before us. And we can do it if we do it together.
We sure can. And I mean, even M&N as an organization has really shifted to not only just be inclusive of memberships that serve nonprofits, but also those in the private corporate sector, and that membership is growing for us. So we're very happy to say that we have a lot of our corporate partners and members here today. Okay, we're gonna switch gears a little bit, and we're going to kind of make it a little bit more personal this time, okay? So at this time, I would like each of you to share a story when you believe you were at your best in promoting culture, the culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also share a time when you found it most challenging in a leadership role. Who wants to begin?
Well, let me tell you that it's always challenging. It just comes with the territory. Elaine can tell you that. It's just something that it comes with being a person of difference. So life is always challenging. So when you make those breakthroughs, it's even more important. But I can tell you, every board that I'm on, I always work to advance diversity at the highest levels. I work to advance diversity at the board level and at the executive management level. And so on one particular board, a very prestigious board, which has, you know, it's very difficult getting on the board. What I decided to do was to ensure that I recommended individuals for committees, because you don't have to be on the board to serve on committees. And so in this way, I had the opportunity to recommend individuals on committees, on the audit committee, which is a tough committee, as you well know, so that individuals on the board could see this person in action, could feel comfortable, and ultimately that person was able to get on the board. Wherever I am, I advocate for people of color to be on the board. I try to do it strategically. I try, like Deb does, I ask, what is the population we serve? How is our board reflective of that? How is our workforce reflective of that? And oh yes, thank you for giving me the data overall, but what does the data look like as we look at executive management, middle management, That's the toughest piece, because you'll find diversity in terms of your most entry level, but it's tougher at the executive level and the middle level. And so one of the suggestions, because it's not enough to just ask or tell people this is something that you should do, but one of the suggestions that I give is use the Rooney Rule. And the Rooney Rule, named after Dan Rooney of Pittsburgh, the Steelers, is that when you have a job open, don't just interview all white candidates. It is important that your management have a diverse slate. Do not fill that job unless a diverse slate is presented. You're not telling the manager who to pick, but you're ensuring diversity is seen. That's one way. Another way is, you know, when you have a job opening, you need to fill that job right away. And so always interview, always interview. If there's a diverse candidate that is really great for your organization and you really value, and you don't have an opportunity open, perhaps what you can do is to go to one of your corporate funders and say, you know, I have a fabulous candidate. We don't have an opportunity open now, but you know, I would love to be able to, for a year, name this the Comcast executive at our firm. Would you pay the yearly salary? And that's the way you continue to innovate your organization, continue to engage others, and continue to engage your executive management in trying to ensure diversity in your organization.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah, diversity is truly important in recruitment, especially at leadership levels. It's really challenging. And I think one of the ways to really break through that is to have diverse networks. So, you know, when I was thinking about this question, you know, I was thinking about my current position at TSNE MissionWorks, and I just wanted to say Jonathan Spack, the 35-year long-term leader who built TSNE, is here. So thank you, Jonathan, for building such a strong Sorry about that. And you know, with the strength of the organization, it also, you know, one of the challenges with the organization is that it was also very white-led. And I'm a woman of color, and you know, changing the profile of the organization and the leadership was very challenging because it meant leveraging all of your networks and, you know, tapping everyone you know to recruit competent, diverse candidates for key leadership positions. And I think the same is true for the board of directors. And you know, I'm happy and proud to say that now, you know, TSNE MissionWorks has, our leadership is 50% people of color, and the board is majority women of color led. And having that type of shift presents a lot of different challenges, because diversity is just the lowest hanging fruit on the, you know, the scale of change. Because next really comes equity. So how do you really change decision-making structures? How do you millennialize the way you work, you know, so that there's more voices at the table and different ways of working together and moving progress forward? And that's the challenge. I think that's the continuing challenge, the, you know, the diversity piece, getting more representation is, yes, it's a challenge, but it's not the heavy lift. You know, the heavy lift is really looking at how you leverage different representation of groups and experiences and backgrounds, and really work towards building a platform or organization that has equity at its core, meaning that, you know, all voices are represented equally, all voices are heard, and the experiences that differ from others are valued.
Did you want to add to that?
So I think being an ally now in work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a leader of a nonprofit, you have to be totally vulnerable, and you have to be willing to make mistakes and learn from them, because it's constant learning. And you asked the question about what's a challenge and a win. I think they're continuous, right? So we had a challenge because, as Carol said, we did not have diversity, and we still don't at the senior level of the organization. So in my go-to style on a situation where I wanted to make sure there was change, and I tend to do things quickly, talking to Jonathan actually, the idea was open up some seats on that senior team and invite people to the table, right? So I decided I would do that. And I sent out an email and I said, okay, we're gonna open up senior management team and we're gonna get more diversity, we're gonna have people of color at the table. Boom, let's go, just people start applying, we're gonna do this. It took, I think, 2 years to make that happen. So the win is, yes, now we have people at the table in our senior team meetings, and that's exciting that people want to be there. But during those 2 years, what had to happen is really, as I learned, about ensuring that people felt like the table was set for them, that there was that inclusion. You can't just say, oh, which I did, now we're gonna have 2 seats, come on in, and people weren't feeling comfortable, didn't feel that sense of inclusion. So it took time to do that. And I think that's what it's about, that you have to be willing, to make mistakes and then learn from them and grow. But once you establish, and this is continuous, trust within the organization, and that you mean what you say and you want to be inclusive and that you're willing to learn to make change, then you're going to see the difference. But it does absolutely take time, and you have to be willing to be vulnerable.
Great points. Okay, now it's your turn. So who has some questions? Please raise your hand. Fernando is in the back with the microphone, and he will come find you. There's one up here. Your teacher voice, I like it.
Twofold question for all panelists. First question is, what is the biggest lesson that your mentor gave you? The second part of that question is, what is your favorite book?
Given that I run a mentoring organization, I should have an answer for you.
I was thinking that.
Pretty bad. So I will say that it's true, that I learned from many people. And that is how I learned, by developing relationships with a lot of different people, looking at their styles of leadership, seeing what I don't want to be like, and learning from those that I want to emulate. And so when I think about mentors along the way, from corporate to nonprofit, there's been many, many lessons, and some of them I've just let go of because they're not working for me now as I've evolved as a leader. And I think now I'm looking at leadership as one that is very much about listening and being a part of the change. And I'll tell you, I've been a Big Sister 12 years, and it was probably like 4 years ago when people were saying things like, we need to have people of color roundtable, we need to have an affinity group, we need to have this, and I had to change with it, and I have. And I think that, so I'm not really answering your question about mentors' advice, but that is how I learn. And I'm learning more now from millennials, which is pretty exciting, that I am changing and evolving with the change, and I feel like that's positive. So, favorite book. I read a lot, and it's always the last book that you read that you're thinking about. And in a funny way, I'm going to tell you my favorite movie is The Great Santini, so I didn't even answer your question on that either.
So I too have had many mentors, and the one that kind of pops into my head when you ask that question was back in college, when I was, as many people do, struggling through finding my self-identity and kind of realizing who I am or who I want to be as a person. I had a professor who I majored in Asian American Studies, and he said to me, you have so many strong opinions, which those who know me, I do, but you never say them. And I am a woman of color. I grew up during busing. I learned how to keep my voice low. I also am a Chinese woman and I come from a very traditional family. So everything in my life up until that point taught me how to keep my voice small. Because if you keep your voice small, you don't get picked on, you don't get noticed, you don't get rocks thrown at you. And he really inspired me and taught me how to use my voice so that I can share those strongly held opinions and yes, make mistakes if I'm sharing an opinion that is disagreeable and learn from it. And I think that has been a critical life lesson for me, and one which I hope I have passed on to my young daughter. Well, she's not young anymore, she's 20 today, which is blowing my mind. But I think that, for a lot of women, not just women of color, having a strong voice is something that, is not uncommon for us to struggle with. So I think that was a really critical lesson for me. And my favorite book, I also read a lot, and it was the last book that I'm reading, but I was like, that's not my favorite. And this may shock people. I was also an English major, so my actual favorite book that I read a lot is Wuthering Heights.
Thank you. I'm actually a composite of the many people that I watch and the many people I see. Those who I admire and those who I disdain. So I look and see how others inspire people, and I love how they treat people. And so I try to emulate them. And I look and see how others ignore people and make people feel small. And I certainly don't have that in my repertoire, or try not to have that in my repertoire, so to speak. The one person in my life, and there really are many, but I've had the good fortune of working for an African-American executive vice president for 4 years at John Hancock, Wayne Budd. And I learned so much from him. Wayne was executive vice president and general counsel of John Hancock. And while all the other executives were riding in the back of the town car, Wayne rode in the front with the African-American driver. Do you know what that meant? Wayne knew the names of every security guard in the building. He taught me that everybody counts. And I loved how natural that was. So when I got to the UN and would go to different embassies and ask for their vote on resolutions, it was very natural to understand that the vote from Great Britain was just as important as the vote from the Bahamas, because every vote counts. But it's Wayne Budd who has enabled me to know all the names of the security guards at the building where I work, and all of the names of the people at the cash register who serve us, because everybody counts. And I'm really blessed to have had him, as I call him the chairman of my board, my personal board of directors, and everybody should have a personal board of directors.
Do you want to share your favorite book?
Oh, come on.
Shameless plug. I got your back. Okay, we have time for one more question from the audience.
Thank you. So you mentioned, Deborah, the importance of taking risks, especially as someone in privilege, right? So whether you're a man or if you're white or if you're both, if you could sort of touch base on that for those of us in the audience, how do you begin to take a risk? Because it's very scary. And nowadays, with the very polarized society that we live in, it seems as if everything you do is in a microscope, right? And everyone's looking at it from a microscope. So what are some steps that you took initially to take a risk? You don't just wake up one day and say, we're going to bring some folks of color on board, but like, how do you actually go about that, and what are some lessons that you've learned? And then just 2 comments quickly. Speaking of diversity, I love that this was the keynote panel, but I'd love to see more diversity in the audience next year. And then I just want to thank you all for recognizing the importance of millennials, because there are some millennials in this room, and we get a really bad flack from some people. So, we are troublemakers and we're optimistic, but I think we have a lot to contribute.
Millennials as troublemakers. I do think baby boomers are troublemakers too, and that's where we come together. I'm just going to say that. I've been thinking about that. Taking a risk. So I think that in my life I've always taken risks, right? So I'm just going to say that. I grew up with 5 older brothers, no sisters, really took risks all my life. And I do think it started sort of in childhood in that way, and pushing the envelope when I was in the private sector. Somebody, I had lunch once with it was the coach for the president, and I was really excited about the fact that he was taking me to lunch. And what he told me is that I needed to really just ramp down my passion, that I needed to stop being so outspoken and pushing the organization. And I did push the organization, and it was better because I did. But the question is, though, how do you, for somebody that might not be used to taking risks, how do you start? And I do think that in a nonprofit, you need the backing of the board, right? I knew that I was making change within the organization. I didn't even tell my board, but I knew that they were going to be supporting me on that. It was important that I included them in on it, because there's change that has to happen on that board, and they're in it with me. There's a lot of change that has to happen there, but they were supporting me. So and then with my team. So it's, so I have a good relationship with the team, people that report to me, try to develop trust, and then you're making mistakes and you're getting up, and that is about risk. So I'm teaching the people that work for us that, yeah, you're going to make a mistake too. Because if I can make a mistake, and I can be vulnerable, and I can say things that are just, I've learned about intent and impact. I've fallen on things. I've said things that were, that just misguided, and people called me on it. They haven't lost their jobs, and they feel like they can talk to me. So it's little by little, but I do think that if you're in the right position, you're doing what you love, if you have the support of your board, then you're going to take risks, right? And then, again, there's the alignment of values. So if you're aligned, you're aligned with your organization is aligned with your values, that goes out to the board, then you're also able to take risks. So it's all of those things coming together, being willing to take a risk for the right thing, and knowing that what's the worst that can happen, right? What is the worst that can happen if you are living your values and, and somebody says, okay, we don't want that. You're out of a job. That's the worst that can happen. I'm not saying that everyone can do that they can just leave a job because they have financial responsibilities, but I do think that the values that drive you are going to be impacted. Your organization is going to be impacted by it, and you have to take risks. You absolutely have to take risks, especially as a white person. As I said, 91% of the girls that we serve are girls of color. It's a moral imperative that we make changes in diversity, equity, inclusion, and big sister, and we are. That's a long answer to that question. Yes.
Okay, we are going to take one more question. It is the final question, and we'll have Elaine and Carol answer this question.
Thank you. We talk about diversity as diversity of look, diversity of thought, diversity of experience. But I'm wondering if you've had challenges with culture, because I heard it mentioned before about how people grow up in different environments. They get added to an organization because of that value, but not everybody within the organization may understand the cultural background. And if there's any kind of proactive effort to understand the culture and embrace it within the rest of the organization?
The way that we look at diversity is to understand that diversity brings about diversity of thought. And diversity of thought brings about innovation. And innovation, from a business perspective, brings about increased business profitability, et cetera. But to get to diversity of thought, think about who you might need around the table. And that's people of difference of any kind. People of color, gender difference, age difference. But if you are serving certainly a population where 91% of the individuals are of one particular race, you want to have strong representation of that culture at the table to best serve that race. Otherwise, you will make huge mistakes. And so then culture, that particular culture, becomes quite important because that's the market you're serving. And so you want to look at it very practically. How can you best understand the market you are serving? So we can look at it very practically, very objectively.
I would just add also that it's important to build a learning culture too, so that you can bring different cultures to the table and be open as an organization or as a business to learning from others. And with that learning, be open to making mistakes and then learning from the mistakes and moving forward. It's a journey. There's not an easy one-stop shop answer for this, but if you build an organization that is really solidly grounded in values and that also has learning, continuous learning as a value, then I think that goes a long way towards really embracing different cultures or just differences of all types.
I think that's a great note to end on, and it actually reminds me a little bit of our pre-planning call where we talked a lot about that. It's about it being a value and about the culture really being the most important part when it comes to this topic. Ladies, thank you so much. This was wonderful. Big round of applause.